Okay, this lecture is going to look at sort of the first phase of the Viking invasions and their impact upon England. So, primarily, what's happening from about the 700s to the 800s, so definitely sort of more towards the end of that period. So, one of the biggest historical sort of mysteries that still has yet to be resolved is why, at this particular time, you see this surge of invasions across the Scandinavian world, and what sort of motivated those individuals to leave their homeland to begin with. And you'll see a lot of different sort of theories to explain that. We do know that it is a period of intense upheaval in Scandinavia itself. So we start to see the emergence of sort of centralized kingdoms. And what that does then is it creates a hierarchy that leaves some people out. And so as these kings sort of rise to the top, other once powerful nobles become increasingly marginalized. And to some degree, the response to that is this desire to leave. So we also see a lot of sort of infighting with these different groups, and in some instances, that sort of infighting does lead to sort of exile. And this is particularly common with sort of younger brothers, younger sons, who aren't necessarily the ones who are going to inherit. So instead of staying and sort of dealing with the limited amount of power and authority they would enjoy in Scandinavia, they look for opportunities elsewhere. It's obviously economically driven as well. So you have a situation where these kings then need wealth to sort of maintain followers. You still have this sort of distribution of wealth, also a gift exchange, sort of a diplomatic exchange of gifts amongst kings. And so there are two ways to get that wealth in Scandinavia. You're either going to trade for it or you're going to raid. And so increasingly raiding becomes a way to sort of raise a lot of movable wealth, and also a way to demonstrate one's power. Another theory that's recently been floated by archaeologists is an interesting one. Their argument is that as these kings become more powerful in Scandinavia, they're able to stabilize the trade routes and provide protection in sort of the mainland. And then that offers less opportunity for individuals to raid in Scandinavia. And so those individuals then look elsewhere for the raiding and the plundering. And then we do know that Scandinavia is pretty rough terrain. It's very mountainous. Obviously, it's very cold. There isn't a lot of agricultural farmland. There aren't a lot of sort of natural resources that you have elsewhere. So again, in places like this, you often see sort of people turning outward, and so looking outward for the resources that they don't necessarily have on their own. Obviously, culture must come into play here to explain just sort of this willingness of Vikings to explore. It really does reflect a particular mindset, as well as sort of there is a militant sort of element to their culture. And some scholars connect this to their sort of religious traditions, this connection between sort of Norse religion, gods and goddesses, is very sort of military centered. Honor is linked to sort of the afterlife and what happens next. And so that sort of instills this sort of martial element within their culture that sort of predisposes them towards warfare. Also, we do know that there's no law code in Scandinavian kingdoms. Justice is retributive, and in a sense, this also sort of lends itself towards a more violent culture. If you don't have ways to minimize conflict within society, you're just going to have sort of higher levels of violence because people are going to try and resolve those conflicts themselves. Also, in terms of culture, Scandinavia is very much a maritime culture, and particularly fishing is sort of essential to their economy. And so we do know that some individuals who are involved in fishing become sort of active in trades as well because they have knowledge of the seas, of tides, of currents. What really separates the Vikings apart from sort of some of these other countries in Western Europe at the time is their willingness to actually sail in the open seas. So obviously there are other countries that have ships that trade that way, but they follow a route so that they are never too outside of the line of sight of the coast. So they hug the coast. Once they go out into the open sea, navigation becomes impossible for them. And the Vikings seem to have mastered this sort of navigation in the open seas much earlier than other people. They also develop boats. This is one of the famous Roskilde boats. There was in a fjord, they found sort of 5 Viking boats in varying degrees of sort of survival. This is one of the more well-preserved ones. And so you can see these boats, they are shallow, and that allows them to sail upriver. They also have a very low mast, so they can go under bridges. A boat like this probably would have allowed about 50 men who row, and then also when the winds are in their favor, they're able to use the sails. And so just this sort of maritime expertise combined with this desire to venture further from one's homeland really does create an incredibly powerful culture when it comes to these sort of ideas of trade and exploration. We're not quite sure where the term Viking came from, but it seems to have some Old Norse roots, and Vikinger or Vikingar is just one who goes on expeditions. And so early on, we do see Vikings extraordinarily active throughout the region. And as you can see here, their activities are by no means confined to England, Iceland. Obviously, they get to the Americas. We also see, in particular, the Swedish Viking armies going up into Rus, which becomes Russia. They reach Constantinople by going through sort of Kiev. We know that there's a contingent of Viking descendants known as the Varangian Guard that becomes sort of the personal guard of the Byzantine emperors. They're also in Italy, and you can see sort of around Spain as well. So extraordinarily sort of active and creating this Viking diaspora. And in part, you know, the negative image that we have of them, obviously they're a very violent people, but who isn't during this period. The negative image we have of them, that level of violence, it's sort of presented as extreme, as over the top, is due to the fact that in so many of the sources, you have Christian authors who are responding in a particular way to these encounters with these groups of people that don't sort of observe the same norms as they do. And that's reflected in a lot of the contemporary sources. So this first wave of early encounters is reflected, and it probably isn't the case that these are the first instances when Vikings showed up on English shores. These are just the first instances that are documented. One of the most sort of detailed, prolific sort of sources for this period is called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This is a really complicated set of texts, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But we do know that some of these early entries in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles do document the appearance of Vikings. So one of the earliest is actually an encounter in Wessex. So the local king, Beorhtric, hears that some ships have pulled into the port, some Danes, and so he sends his steward to go down to escort them to his residence so he can sort of talk to them, see why they're there, maybe engage in trade. And when his steward goes down, he's actually slaughtered by the Danes. And so this is just sort of this surprising moment, like, why would they do that? So there is a lot of this sort of reflected in these early instances of documentation, just surprise at the behavior of the Vikings because it was something that the English just weren't used to. In 793, the first sort of major moment that sort of has shockwaves sent across the England and parts of the Western world is a Viking raid on Lindisfarne Abbey. So that first sort of Danish encounter, it's kind of like, oh, this is odd, this is unusual, but very little wider impact from these small-scale encounters. Lindisfarne, however, not only targets one of the wealthiest monasteries in England, but sort of the level of destruction that results really does sort of reverberate throughout this part of the world, and we see this reflected in a variety of documents in addition to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. We also see some monasteries in Northumbria in 800, and the island of Shepney are attacked. So these are initially sort of every few years, and then gradually around 800, what we start to see is sort of an annual event. Sort of Viking raiders, whether they're Danes or Swedes or Norwegians, are going to show up somewhere off the shores of England, Scotland, Ireland at some point during the summer. You can see from this image of Lindisfarne, obviously it's no longer intact, but it's right on the coast. So imagine how incredibly vulnerable these monasteries would be to these Viking invasions as a result of their location. So again, that's in part why these early raids target monasteries and nunneries. They're located along the coasts. The people who live there are monks, they're nuns, they're individuals who are obviously committed to nonviolence. They do probably have some local peasants and who help them work the land, but you don't have sort of an armed presence within these monastic foundations, and very few of them have any sort of walls or fortifications. They're also really, really ideal targets for these early raids because of the amount of movable wealth that you find there. So things that you would decorate an altar with, so a gold chalice or sort of a painting frame made out of silver. There's just a lot of movable wealth, precious metals, precious jewels, and in some instances they also have they take hostages. So the people who aren't killed in the process of the raid are taken as hostages, and then these hostages can be ransomed back. So as we sort of saw before with someone like Bede, you do have younger members of noble families who become monks or become nuns. And so they're from very prominent families, and these families are willing to pay a fair amount of money to ransom them back. There is a number of sort of stories of these sort of earliest raids on these monastic institutions, and almost all of them authored by members of the church who obviously express this outrage because precisely because the people who are targeted are monks and nuns. So these people occupy sort of a certain level of sort of spiritual sanctity within medieval society. So the fact that these Vikings don't discriminate, so not only are they killing unarmed men and women, these are monks and nuns. So it really does sort of shake some of these clerical authors to their core. There is one example of an instance where a Viking raiding party shows up outside of a nunnery. I think it's at Wearmouth. And because they fear being raped, which is not uncommon when the Vikings encounter the local people, including nuns, the nuns actually cut off their noses because they're convinced if they're disfigured, the Viking men will leave them alone. And it seems to have worked. They weren't raped. They were killed. So these types of stories you can see, like psychologically, are very sort of reflect sort of how the local population is just sort of confounded by the level of violence and the actions of these Vikings. So one example that sort of combines a few of these things that I've been talking about. So we know there's a raid in Kent. And one of the things that's stolen is this manuscript, the Codex Aureus. Now it's called the Codex Aureus of Stockholm, because it's in a library in Stockholm. And it's an illustrated manuscript that includes the 4 Gospels and a few other texts. And you can see it's lavishly illustrated with gold foil. And it's stolen in the course of a raid. An attempt is made to sort of track it down and then ransom it back. And eventually it returns to the hands of some local Kentish nobles. And there's an inscription in the very first, on the very first sort of parchment page And you can see that here. So Elderman Alfred and his wife Weber sort of pay to get this manuscript back, and along with some others, and then they donate it to Canterbury as sort of a way to demonstrate their own piety. So clearly, these you can see this sort of sits at this intersection of what motivates the Vikings, as well as the response of the local Anglo-Saxon nobility, and how this is all connected to sort of the monastic culture of the period. So around the mid 9th century, we start to see a shift. And instead of showing up with maybe 30 ships, some of these Viking raids show up with as many as 300, 350. And if each ship can carry about 50 men, you're starting to talk about really sizable armies. And so we see these armies sort of engage in military conflict. So they aren't just raids anymore. They're actually enough people that they're moving a little bit further inland and encountering local resistance. 836 and then again in 843, there's a significant sized engagement at Carhampton. In 840, there's 2, Southampton and Portland. And then really the first major indication that things are changing, 851, we know that a sizable Viking army actually spends the winter in England. Until this point, the habit was to come during the summer when the seas were still easy to traverse, and then come fall to return to Scandinavia. And this is sort of this pivotal moment when that pattern changes, and now we see them spending winters in England, and then gradually this allows them to sort of grow that army larger and larger, and also demands more resources and more territory to sustain that population over the course of the winter. And you can see in this particular manuscript image, this reflection of, this is intended to demonstrate sort of the enormity of a Viking army in sort of small scale. So until around 850, most of these larger scale military engagements were still won by the local Anglo-Saxon nobility. The kings of Mercia, the kings of Wessex, in some instances the kings of Kent. So while we do know that it's happening, we also know that for the most part, they're not losing these encounters. They're not losing these battles, and that's going to shift after 850 as well. And we'll look at sort of the second phase of invasion. What we do know is just from this initial invasion, a few sort of changes to Anglo-Saxon society. One is it contributes to centralization. We've already seen these processes of centralization and consolidation underway, and this is going to accelerate that. So, for example, what starts to happen is some of these smaller kingdoms that don't have the same levels of protection, they don't have the resources and the sizable armies, appeal to the larger ones that do. And in particular, Wessex is called upon to help some of these smaller kingdoms. And so then those smaller kingdoms acknowledge the authority of Wessex. Obviously, the infrastructure is extraordinarily damaged, not so much by these raids, but more as we start to see more extended sort of stays. We start to see sort of roads destroyed. We start to see bridges destroyed. Also, you know, the burning down of villages and settlements is going to be an issue as well. And the destruction of a lot of religious sites. In most cases, this is sort of temporary. So some of the more wealthy religious sites don't necessarily rebuild where they were after they're destroyed. They move inland so they have more protection. However, some of the smaller ones just don't have the sort of resources to start over. And so the monks or the nuns who resided there will move to another community to live out their life. And so there is sort of what we see is sort of a downturn in the in the sort of the monastic and religious life of England during this period because of all of these stresses placed on them by the Vikings. At the same time, however, we do see calls for the intensification of piety. So, for example, we do see in charters people donating land to monasteries so that they can get sort of this spiritual benefits of that donation, and they explicitly say they're motivated by fear of the heathens. So people who were personally impacted by a Viking raid, by a Viking attack, knowing that death could be imminent, and so they want to make sure that when they go to that afterlife, that things will be taken care of. We also see this sort of piety reflected in some of the letters of the period. So this is a manuscript that's in the British Library. And so the man in the brown with almost like the blue hair is Alcuin. And Alcuin is a famous monk who was from England, and he's actually brought to the court of Charlemagne, and that's Charlemagne there in the center, sort of welcoming him. Alcuin actually writes a letter, so he's at Charlemagne's court, and he hears about this raid on Lindisfarne. And so he writes a letter that he circulates, and he talks about sort of the violence of these people, the desecration of the altar, and the damage done to all of the books, the damage done to the church, the number of people that were killed or maimed, or taken hostage or enslaved. And ultimately what he says is that this is punishment, that Christians are being punished because of too much fornication, adultery, they're engaging in incestuous behaviors, vanity, they're robbing each other. And so this is sort of punishment sent by God, and sort of a warning to Christians that they need to sort of amend their ways, or these raids are just going to continue.